The night shift nurse moved through Sacred Heart like a ghost, the kind nobody notices until something breaks. 2:47 in the morning, fluorescent lights buzzing their tired hum, and Sarah Chen had already been awake for 18 hours. The ER at Norfolk Sacred Heart ran on a skeleton crew after midnight, 2 residents, 1 overworked attending, and nurses who'd learned to function on coffee and muscle memory. Sarah had perfected the art of invisibility 3 years ago. Worn scrubs faded to the color of old bruises. Hair pulled back so tight it eliminated distraction. Hands steady enough to place and 4 while a patient coded beside her, veins collapsing, pressure dropping, everyone else's voices rising, and her own staying level. Just give me the 14 gauge. The thing about being invisible was that people underestimated what you could see. The stretcher came through the ER bay doors at 2:51, pushed by paramedics whose radio chatter had mentioned complications from shrapnel wounds, old ones, infected maybe, and a patient who couldn't communicate beyond hand signals. The man on the gurney was probably 50 but looked 70. Skin the color of old copper. Missing 3 fingers on his left hand. As that had stopped looking at anything a long time ago. Sarah was already moving toward the intake desk when she heard the paramedic say the words, "Mute veteran, for years post-discharge, no known next of kin, complications from IED fragment migration." The way the paramedic said it made it sound like a liability. The way Sarah heard it made something shift behind her ribs. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. The overhead page crackled for Dr. Patterson in ortho, then something about a supply shortage in the ICU, and Sarah was already reading the chart the paramedic had left, her eye scanning vitals and history and the blank space where next of kin should be. The patient's name was Marcus Webb. 48 years old. Discharged from Fort Liberty 4 years ago with what the chart described as non-disclosed military service, which meant classified, which meant the kind of operations that didn't appear in databases. Helmand Province. The name sat there in the history like a key nobody was supposed to recognize, and Sarah's chest tightened in a way she'd trained herself not to show. She was moving him to Bay 3 when she saw it. The jacket draped over the stretcher rails, military surplus, the kind from 30 years ago, faded to the color of ash and sand. Sarah's hands moved on their own, lifting the jacket, her fingers finding the interior lining where someone had sewn a patch with surgical precision. She didn't need to look. She already knew what it would be. But her eyes found it anyway, the insignia of Operation Graveyard, 3rd Battalion Special Forces Command, the unit designation that didn't exist in any official capacity. The patch her own unit had worn on their jackets before the extraction, before the debrief that came with orders to disappear into civilian life, before someone decided that Major Sarah Chen should become invisible. Pain was information. That's what they taught you in selection. Pain told you what was breaking. This information told her that the man on the gurney had been there in Helmand 20 years ago. Probably a junior enlisted then, maybe an attaché from another unit, maybe someone who'd done something that classified records didn't dare document. And now he was here in Norfolk with shrapnel wounds opening up inside him, bleeding into the spaces where no one was looking, a ghost from a ghost operation parked in Bay 3. She was still holding the jacket when Dr. Ashford appeared at the bay entrance. The chief of surgery moved like a man who'd never had to hurry, expensive loafers, pressed white coat, the kind of authority that came from family money and the right connections, not from hands-on emergency medicine. His gaze swept across the patient, across the vitals, across Sarah's face for exactly 3 seconds. Then it dropped to her hands. To the jacket. To the patch. Sarah saw something flicker in his expression like a door opening and closing too fast for most people to notice. But she'd been trained to read expressions in 60-degree heat while bullets snapped overhead, so she saw it. Recognition. And something underneath it that looked like hardness. What's his status? Ashford's voice carried the precise diction of someone accustomed to being obeyed without explanation. Sarah kept her tone flat, deferential, the way night shift nurses spoke to surgeons. 48-year-old male, presenting with complications from old IED fragmentation. Vital stable but trending toward tachycardia. History suggests the shrapnel may have migrated. He's mute, non-responsive to verbal commands but follows visual instruction. Paramedics noted possible sepsis in the wound tract. And you are? Sarah, night shift charge nurse. Ashford nodded slowly, his eyes moving back to the patient, then to the jacket still in Sarah's hands, then back to her face. The movement took 5 seconds. In that 5 seconds, something calcified in the space between them. He turned without answering and walked to the nursing station, pulled the patient's file, and Sarah watched his fingers trace the history, so his jaw tightened when he reached the line that said Helmand Province, non-disclosed operations. The night shift atmosphere changed after that. A phone call came into the main desk at 3:15. Then another at 3:40. Sarah was checking the patient's fluids when Dr. Patterson appeared, looked at the chart, looked at Marcus Webb, and shook his head. "I'm not qualified for this complexity," he said, and left. 20 minutes later, Dr. Reeves came by, reviewed the file for 90 seconds, and said the resource allocation didn't support taking him. Then Dr. Morrison. Then Dr. Nguyen. Then Dr. Reynolds, who actually stepped into the bay, looked at the wound, and walked back out mid-examination without a word. Sarah didn't need to ask why. She'd worked emergency medicine long enough to recognize the pattern. One call from the chief of surgery could redirect an entire patient roster. One word in the right ear could convince 7 doctors that this particular case was too complex, too risky, too much trouble for a patient whose existence seemed classified. By the time the sun started turning the parking lot grey at 5:42, the pattern was established. Dr. Brooks had said Marcus Webb was a lost cause. Dr. Hamilton had refused to authorize the imaging that might have shown where the shrapnel had migrated. And Dr. Ashford had positioned himself at the nursing station between 4 and 5 in the morning, watching, waiting, his presence alone enough to keep every other attending on the floor from volunteering. Sarah sat at the bedside because that's what you did for patients nobody else would touch. She changed the dressings. She checked his vitals. She kept the floor running and made sure the monitors stayed connected. Marcus Webb's eyes followed her movements with the kind of awareness that suggested he understood the situation perfectly. His hand, the one with 5 fingers, reached out at one point and caught her sleeve, and she felt something transfer between them in that contact. Recognition. The knowledge that whatever had happened in Helmand had left its mark on both of them, had shaped them into people who understood what it meant to be invisible, to survive operations that didn't officially exist, to carry scars that nobody was supposed to see. The next words out of Ashford's mouth would change everything, but Sarah didn't know that yet. She was still sitting in the fluorescent light of Sacred Heart, still invisible in her worn scrubs, still holding a jacket with a patch from a mission that the Pentagon had buried. The overhead page crackled for an orderly, a patient transport, something routine, and somewhere in the building, 7 doctors had already decided that Marcus Webb wasn't worth the trouble. 7 rejections. 7 conversations with Ashford that had steered them away. 7 tiny moments of cowardice that had constructed a wall around one man's last chance at survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The file landed on the nurse's station at 2,230 hours like a verdict. Dr. Patel didn't examine the veteran. Didn't even approach the bed. He read the intake summary, his face tightening as his eyes moved down the page, and when he looked up at Sarah, his expression had already calcified into something that resembled sympathy but felt like condemnation. Liability nightmare, he said to no one in particular, setting the folder down with deliberate care, as if the chart itself might contaminate his hands. We're not equipped for this level of complication. Not our facility. He walked away without looking back, his white coat catching the fluorescent light like a sail leaving harbor. Sarah watched him go. She'd seen refusal before, in the eyes of patrol commanders who wouldn't authorize rescue missions, in the silence of officers who'd signed off on operations so classified that the men who carried them out had to forget their own names. But this was different. This was 7 times, she would learn. 7 tiny moments of cowardice that would construct a wall around one man's last chance at survival. Dr. Morrison arrived at 2,315 hours with the energy of someone already exhausted by the night shift. He performed a cursory examination, blood pressure cuff, stethoscope, a quick visual scan, and his jaw worked as he reviewed the imaging. Too complex, he said, removing his gloves with sharp, efficient movements. Insufficient resources. We'd need a trauma surgeon on standby, orthopedic backup, and frankly, the prognosis doesn't justify the overhead. He didn't phrase it as a question. He didn't ask Sarah what she thought. He simply stated it as fact, the way men accustomed to authority state things, and then he left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the finality of a courtroom gavel. By midnight, Dr. Nguyen had examined the veteran and declared the case too complex for their facility. By 00:45, Dr. Reynolds had begun an assessment, stopped mid-examination, muttered, "I don't have time for this," and walked away mid-breath. By 01:30, Dr. Brooks had reviewed the imaging, shaken his head with the certainty of a man who'd already made up his mind, and whispered "lost cause" loud enough for Sarah to hear from across the nurses' station. By 02:15, Dr. Hamilton had refused to authorize surgery, citing budget constraints with the precision of someone reading from a prepared statement. 7 doctors. 7 refusals. 7 different ways of saying the same thing: this man was not worth saving. Sarah had stood at the nurse's station through each dismissal, restocking supplies, checking medication counts, performing the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept a hospital functioning, and with each refusal, she'd felt something ancient stirring in her chest, something that had learned to survive in a combat zone where the official order was to forget you'd ever been there. She recognized the unit patch sewn inside the veteran's jacket lining. She recognized it the way you recognize a scar on your own body. That insignia belonged to an operation in Helmand Province so classified that the Pentagon had erased her file, buried her rank, and ordered her to disappear into civilian life. And this man, this mute, dying veteran, had been part of it. At 0300 hours, Dr. Ashford himself arrived to review the chart. He was chief of surgery, which meant he was accustomed to authority working like gravity, pulling downward, inevitable, absolute. Sarah watched him as he read the file at the nurse's station, his eyes moving with mechanical precision. When he looked up, he caught her gaze. Caught her studying the jacket patch. Caught her recognition hanging in the space between them like smoke. The color of his eyes reminded her of storm clouds over an ocean before artillery strikes. They held her for 3 seconds, long enough for understanding to pass between them, long enough for her to know that he'd seen what she'd seen, and that he would use it against her. "Dismiss," he said to the attending resident, not breaking eye contact with Sarah. "Case is beyond our scope. Recommend transfer to a level 1 facility." He closed the chart with enough force that the sound cracked across the unit like a gunshot. Then he walked away. Hours dissolved into the rhythmic hum of ventilators and monitor beeps, the liquid whoosh of 4 pumps, the sound of a hospital breathing in its own steady, indifferent way. Sarah worked her reassignments, supply inventory, medication counts, the tasks designed to keep her moving but invisible, to remind her that she was not a lead nurse anymore, was not a woman whose judgment could be trusted, was not anyone whose opinion on patient care mattered. The overhead page crackled at 0345 hours. Nightingale to administration. The entire floor heard it. 2 residents snickered near the medication dispensary. A nursing assistant smirked behind her computer. Nightingale. The nickname that had followed Sarah through 3 years of night shifts, whispered by staff who thought she was too quiet, too observant, too interested in things that weren't her concern. Sarah had never publicly objected to it, had never corrected anyone, had walked through those corridors accepting the mockery the way soldiers accept rain in a combat zone, as something inevitable, something that couldn't be stopped, only endured. She walked to administration with her spine straight and her hands steady. Dr. Ashford was waiting in his office, leaning against the edge of his desk like a man who'd positioned himself with calculated casualness. "You have an unusual interest in this patient, Nurse Chen," he said before she could speak. His voice moved like a predator circling, comfortable in its own superiority. "Unusual interests create unusual problems. Do we understand each other?" Sarah took one measured breath. She'd been trained to withstand interrogation, to resist psychological pressure, to maintain composure when the world wanted to break her into pieces. She'd stood in a burning compound in Helmand Province and pulled a dying child from rubble while bullets stitched patterns through the air around her, and she'd been ordered to forget it had ever happened. She could withstand this. She could withstand anything. A single tear escaped her left eye. Just one. It ran down her cheek like a crack in a dam, and she watched Dr. Ashford's expression shift, surprise that she would break, satisfaction that his threat had worked. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "Perfectly, doctor," she said. Her voice had the quality of glass, the quality of something that could cut if you gripped it wrong. He blinked. For a moment, his certainty faltered. The next morning, at shift change, Dr. Ashford was waiting in the parking lot with the incoming staff arriving in clusters, their breath fogging in the Norfolk cold. Sarah watched him gather them, watched him perform the ritual of humiliation that was designed to bury her completely. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice carrying across the asphalt like a pronouncement. "Sarah Chen is relieved of lead nurse duties." Poor judgment. Inability to prioritize. He said it as if he were reading from official documentation, as if this were a procedural necessity rather than punishment. 15 people witnessed it. 15 people heard her rank stripped away like a sergeant being dishonorably discharged. Sarah stood in the cold dawn, her breath fogging in the winter air, and said nothing at all. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break in public. She simply stood there, a woman in scrubs, a former major in the United States military standing in a parking lot being publicly humiliated by a man who had no idea what he was looking at. The truth was that she'd been erased before. The military had buried her once after Helmand Province, had classified her service so thoroughly that the paperwork no longer existed. And now Ashford was finishing the job with the precision of a man who was very, very good at making people disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere inside the hospital, in a room on the 3rd floor, a mute veteran was slowly dying, and every doctor who could have saved him had walked away. The supply closet on the 3rd floor smelled like industrial bleach and failure. Sarah counted medications with mechanical precision, bottles aligned, dates checked, inventory logged into a system that took 3 times longer than the old one. This was the work Ashford had reassigned to her, the grinding humiliation of making her hands busy with tasks a first-year technician could do blindfolded. Grunt work. Punishment disguised as duty. The fluorescent overhead light flickered in that way that made time feel broken, and she'd been working this closet for 16 hours across 2 nights, which meant she deliberately positioned herself nowhere near the ER, nowhere near decisions, nowhere near anything that resembled actual nursing. She understood the strategy. Keep her visible but useless. Keep her occupied but powerless. Keep her in places where she couldn't help anyone, couldn't touch a patient, couldn't prove that she was anything more than the trembling, incompetent woman Ashford had painted her to be in front of the arriving shift. What Ashford didn't account for was that Sarah's hands weren't the only thing moving. Her eyes were still scanning. Her ears were still listening. The hospital walls carried sound like water carries current, and from 3 floors up, if you knew how to listen, if you'd spent 2 decades learning to read the acoustic signatures of combat zones, you could hear everything that mattered. On the second night of her exile, around 2,147 hours, Sarah was reorganizing the cardiac medication shelf when she heard it, the change in the veteran's room. Not a change in the machines. A change in the absence of response to the machines. The monitor was registering, the ventilator was breathing, but something underneath had shifted. The quality of silence around a patient in distress has a color, a weight. Experienced trauma nurses feel it before the numbers drop. She'd learned to feel it in a forward operating base in Helmand Province where the difference between noticing and not noticing meant 23 Marines going home or 22. Sarah's hands kept moving on autopilot while her mind mapped the 3rd floor. The veteran was in room 312, standard trauma recovery setup. 2 nurses assigned, both newer, both by rotation, both following the standing orders written by doctors who'd collectively decided his case was too complex, too unprofitable, too risky. The standing orders meant minimal intervention. Minimal checking. Minimal everything except documentation that they were doing the bare minimum. She heard the monitor spike at 2,213 hours. Elevated heart rate. Then a slight pressure dip that corrected itself. Then another. The kind of pattern that civilian nurses see as variance. The kind of pattern that combat medics recognize as internal hemorrhage looking for exit wounds. Sarah set down the vial of milrinone and stepped into the hallway. From the supply closet window, she had a line of sight to the nursing station. Both nurses assigned to the third floor were charting, heads down, eyes on screens, the modern way of being present and absent simultaneously. The veteran's monitor displayed in the corner of the unit's central screen, 3 small numbers that no one was watching. Pressure 10 for 68. Then 102, 64. Then 162. Drift. Slow, steady drift downward like a ship taking on water that no one could see. She wasn't supposed to be checking on him. Her reassignment made that explicit. But her eyes hadn't been reassigned. Her training hadn't been reassigned. The thing that lived in her chest, the thing that had survived Helmand Province and 2 Purple Hearts and a classified operation she wasn't allowed to speak about, that couldn't be reassigned to a supply closet no matter how Ashford tried. By 22:47 hours, the pressure was 98/60ths. By 23:01 hours, the rhythm on the monitor had tightened, faster, the way a heartbeat gets when it's fighting something it can't see. Sarah stood in the medication closet doorway, still in plain sight, still technically on her reassignment, still watching the numbers on the distant monitor tick downward like a countdown. She could page a doctor. That was her job. Any nurse seeing those trends was supposed to escalate, follow protocol, use the chain of command that Ashford had weaponized against her. She could page. The 7 doctors who'd walked away from this patient would never come. Not for trending pressures. Not for what looked like normal post-operative drift. Not for anything except a full code, and by the time a full code came, there would be nothing anyone could do because the bleed inside him had already won. The knowledge hit her the way recognition always did, sudden, crystalline, absolute. This was an internal bleed. Shrapnel wounds from the explosive devices in Kandahar, Fallujah, places where the United States military had learned to look for patterns in the human body that no civilian medical school taught you. The chest imaging the 7 doctors had reviewed would show nothing because shrapnel bleeds don't always show up on CT. They show up in the subtle shift of vitals, the way a patient's blood pressure drops 5 points per hour, 10 points per hour, the way the body talks in numbers when the mouth can't speak. She'd seen this pattern 17 times in her life. 3 of those soldiers had died because the pattern was recognized too late. 14 had lived because someone, a surgeon, a senior medic, someone with the authority and the training and the willingness to look, had seen the numbers and said, "We're going in. We're looking for it. We're not waiting for dramatic signs." At 03:01 hours on the 3rd night, the monitor flatlined in the traditional way, the straight line that meant the heart had stopped, the alarms that sounded like the world breaking apart, the overhead page that crackled through every speaker in Sacred Heart Memorial. Code Blue, Room 312. All available personnel, Code Blue. Sarah was down the back stairs in 8 seconds. Her hands moved before her mind finished the decision, muscle memory taking the wheel the way it always did when training exceeded thought. Her locker in the break room still contained the plastic MRE package she'd kept from the VA donation drive 2 months ago, something she'd grabbed automatically, the way old habits worked, the way soldiers never stopped being soldiers. The meal itself she'd given to a homeless vet outside the hospital entrance, but the packaging she'd kept. Biodegradable. Waterproof. Sterile. The kind of thing a forward surgical team might use when proper equipment wasn't available. The code team was assembling when she entered room 312, and for a moment, just a moment, nobody stopped her because she was moving with the confidence of someone who belonged in a crisis, not the hesitation of someone who'd been reassigned to medication inventory. She was in her scrubs. She had the look. She carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The senior resident was already at the patient's chest, performing compressions, another nurse setting up the defibrillator pads. Sarah moved to the left side of the bed where the patient's cardiac monitor wires ran, where she could see the color of his skin, where she could read the story his body was telling. Pale. Cold. The kind of cold that meant blood volume was dropping. Not cardiogenic shock. Hypovolemic. Hemorrhage. "Where's the bleed?" She said it not as a question but as a statement, the way commanders spoke when they weren't requesting information but demanding it. The resident didn't look up. Unknown source. No external. Internal. Shrapnel wound. It's been slow bleed since admission. Sarah's voice had changed. The careful deferential tone Ashford had heard from her the night before was gone, replaced by something that came from a different part of her chest. Pressure's been dropping 8 points per hour. He's exsanguinating. Who are you? Or the nurse asked. Sarah was already moving, ripping open the MRE package in her hands, her fingers working the material into a makeshift occlusive dressing, the kind of improvised field medicine that wasn't in civilian protocols because civilian hospitals weren't supposed to need field medicine. But she'd learned it in a combat surgical team course, the kind of training that still showed up in her hands even though it wasn't supposed to exist in her medical record. Step back, she said to the resident. Not a request. A command. Something in the tone of it, something that carried the weight of rank and experience and the unmistakable sound of someone who'd given orders that people had obeyed or died, and the resident stepped back. She placed her fingers on the patient's left lower quadrant, feeling for the specific landmarks of internal anatomy. Pain is data. In Helmand Province, she'd learned to read the body's architecture the way cartographers read maps, every ridge, every hollow, every space where organs lived and bled. The spleen. That was her calculation. Traumatic rupture of the spleen from the original shrapnel wound, slow leak, 7 days of doctors who'd missed it because they weren't looking for it, weren't trained for it, didn't care enough to look. She found the bleeding point with her hands, her fingers following landmarks that no night shift nurse should be able to identify. The resident was staring. The nurses were staring. She applied manual pressure, direct, firm, the way you compress a bleeder in a field hospital when the surgeon isn't standing next to you yet, when the only thing between the patient and death is your hand and your memory and the absolute certainty that this was the exact moment that mattered. Pressure cuff. Now, she said. Someone handed it to her. She wrapped it around the abdomen, tightening it over the pressure point, improvising a technique called pelvic binding, used in the military for pelvic fractures, adapted here for splenic hemorrhage. It wasn't in any civilian protocol. It wasn't supposed to work this way. But her hands knew. Get me 18-gauge lines. 2 of them. Typo start the massive transfusion protocol. Push 1 mg epi 4. Get the OR ready for open abdominal. Her voice was steady. Not fast. Not panicked. The voice of someone who'd given these orders with the rotor wash of a Black Hawk in the background, who'd done this while incoming fire sounded like rain on a metal roof. The monitor changed. The rhythm found itself. 84 beats per minute. Then 90. Then climbing toward normal, the way a human heart climbs out of despair when someone stops the bleeding and gives it blood to pump. His blood pressure responded. 70/40. Then 80/50. Then 90/60, the numbers climbing like a prayer being answered, the O2 saturation rising with it. 103. 104. 105. Stable. She'd been doing this for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Her scrubs were blood dark up to her elbows. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with the specific tremor that came from channeling more adrenaline than a human body was supposed to survive. The kind of tremor that came from combat medicine, from forward surgical teams, from the part of her that had been trained to do things no civilian nurse was trained to do. The room had gone utterly quiet. The machines beeping. The ventilator breathing. But human sound, gone. Suspended. The kind of silence that happens when people witness something they don't have words for, when they see something their training didn't prepare them to see. Dr. Ashford stood in the doorway. His tablet was in his hand. His face was composed. His eyes were on Sarah, and they were the eyes of a man who had just watched her do something that his reassignment, his humiliation, his systematic destruction had been designed to prevent. His eyes were the eyes of a man who understood that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation. She didn't meet his gaze. She was still looking at the patient, still monitoring the monitor, still doing the work. But she heard him move, heard him turn, heard him step out into the hallway to make a phone call that she would later learn was to the hospital board, to the state licensing committee, to his attorney, and to a news station that had already decided the narrative before he'd finished speaking. By 0300 hours, she was being escorted out of the hospital with her possessions in a cardboard box that had held copy paper in a previous life. Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway at 3:56 a.m. like something summoned by the fluorescent lights themselves. His face was the color of old concrete. Sarah stood at the bedside with the veteran's blood dried across her forearms, her hands still steady, her breathing controlled, her eyes fixed on the monitor where the green line climbed and held and climbed again. Oxygen saturation at 94%. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The kind of stable that came from understanding that pain is information and blood is data, and that some lessons learned in Helmand Province never needed to be forgotten, only buried deeper. "Step away from the patient," Ashford said. His voice wasn't loud. It was the voice of a man who had never in his professional life needed to raise it. Sarah didn't move. She adjusted the 4-drip rate by a fraction, watching the numbers recalibrate. "I said step away." Ashford's fingers were white against the door frame. "You are suspended, effective immediately, for practicing medicine without a license. For performing procedures outside your scope of practice. For," his voice started climbing now, climbing like the oxygen saturation had climbed, climbing like something that couldn't hold altitude much longer, for assaulting a patient. She turned then. Slow. Measured. The kind of movement a hunter makes when it doesn't need to run. Her scrubs were soaked dark red from chest to hip. The blood made her look like something carved from stone and fire. "He would have died," Sarah said. 10 words exactly. Not a request. Not an apology. Ashford's jaw tightened. A muscle flickered along his right temple like a second heartbeat. "Get out of this hospital. Now. Security is en route. You will surrender your badge, your access codes, and your employment termination will be processed by 0600 hours." He paused. His eyes moved across her, the blood, the steady hands, the absolute absence of fear, and something flickered behind them. Recognition. Understanding. Then erasure. He chose erasure. "You're done here." Sarah walked past him without acknowledgement. Without breaking eye contact. Without the courtesy of stepping aside, so Ashford had to move, had to shift his body, had to get out of her way. The veteran's hand reached out as she passed. His fingers, trembling, not from pain but from the medication still moving through his system, brushed her wrist. He didn't speak. His mouth opened and closed. The words lived somewhere too deep to reach. She kept walking. By 4:15 a.m., Ashford was on the hospital phone in his office on the 4th floor, his voice the practiced cadence of a man who had made these kinds of calls before, who knew exactly which tone worked on which type of authority. Hospital Board Administrator. State Licensing Committee Official. News Director at Channel 7. In each call, his voice modulated, apologetic with the board, concerned with the state, outraged with the press. A nurse. Acting outside her training. Endangering the patient. No prior incidents on record, but clearly unstable. Clearly dangerous. Clearly someone who needed to be removed from patient care immediately to protect the integrity of Sacred Heart Hospital. By 5:08 a.m., 2 security officers in navy polyester uniforms stood outside the employee locker room watching her pack. Not watching to be professional. Watching because Ashford had called down and asked them to observe. To ensure she didn't steal anything. Medications. Hospital property. The kind of paranoia that blooms when you're trying to bury someone before the sun comes up. Sarah's locker held almost nothing. 3 years of night shifts and she'd accumulated the possessions of a woman who'd learned long ago that ownership was a liability. A cracked mug from a VA donation drive. A dying succulent that someone had brought in as a gift in 2019. A photograph in a frame so old the metal had oxidized to the color of storm clouds. The photograph showed 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, all under 30, all carrying weapons, all standing in front of a mud brick compound that didn't exist anymore. One of them had her arm around a girl, just a girl, 6 years old maybe, holding a stuffed animal with one eye missing. The child's face was pressed against Sarah's chest. The other 4 soldiers were smiling. They were all dead. She placed the photograph carefully in the cardboard box the security officer held. It had held copy paper once. Now it held the evidence of her erasure. The walk from Sacred Heart to the bus stop took 12 minutes. The rain had started somewhere around 5 a.m., the kind of Norfolk rain that fell from so far up it seemed to take personal offense at the existence of the earth below. Sarah's jacket soaked through. Her hair plastered to her neck. The cardboard box, the recycled cardboard, the thin cardboard that had never been meant to hold anything that mattered, started to disintegrate. The corners softened. The bottom began to sag. She made it 3 blocks before sitting down on the bus stop bench. The bench was metal and cold and wet. The kind of bench that had been designed specifically to discourage lingering. She lingered anyway. Around her, Norfolk was beginning to wake. A man in a maintenance uniform walked past, pushing a shopping cart. A delivery truck rumbled past, its brake lights painting the rain red. No one looked at her. No one saw a decorated major sitting at a bus stop covered in blood and rain. They saw a disheveled woman with a disintegrating cardboard box. They saw someone disposable. She opened the photograph carefully, the paper already starting to curl from moisture. The rain fell on the faces of her patrol team, E. Martinez with his broken tooth grin, Foster with his rifle held like he was cradling a newborn, Jackson with the scar across his forehead from a shrapnel wound that he'd taped over to keep fighting, Williams and Garrett flanking the child like bookends, like they were building something that couldn't fall. All of them gone. Helmand Province. Day 847 of Operation Graveyard. The terrorist cell had hidden themselves in a compound that housed 23 civilians. The mission parameters were clear: eliminate the target, preserve collateral. The child had been in the wrong place. Sarah had pulled her out of the rubble after the explosion, held her while she screamed, carried her to the extraction point while her own blood painted the sand behind her. The military had buried that operation. No public record. No medals given. No ceremonies. Just Sarah and a discharge that read honorable and an understanding that if she spoke about what she'd done, if she revealed classified operations, she would spend the rest of her life in a federal prison. So she'd chosen the other death. The civilian death. The disappearance. She'd become a nurse because nurses healed things. Because nurses were invisible. Because no one asked decorated combat veterans to push mops and check vitals in the dark hours when the hospital belonged to the skeleton crew and the dying. And now Ashford had finished the job the military had started. He'd erased her again. This time, there would be no second chance. No healing. No invisibility that protected. Just visibility that destroyed. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Messages from colleagues. I'm so sorry. They're saying you went crazy. Channel 7 is running a story tonight at 11. She turned off the phone. Not deleted it. Just powered it down like a light switch, darkness absolute, all the voices cutting out mid-sentence. At Sacred Heart, 3 blocks away in the building she would never enter again, something was happening that she didn't know about yet. Couldn't know about yet. The mute veteran had awakened at 9:45 a.m. in recovery, his body moving through the emergence delirium of anesthesia, his eyes snapping open to fluorescent ceiling tiles and the rhythmic beep of machines that measured his heartbeat back to himself. A young nurse named Jennifer Chen, no relation, though Sarah would wonder later if there was something in the name, something that traveled through blood, was checking his vitals when she mentioned it casually, the way you mention weather. That nurse Sarah really fought for you. Took a real risk. Shame what happened. They're firing her today. The veteran's eyes focused. Snapped into clarity with the precision of a weapon acquiring a target. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. For 17 months he had been silent, his muteness a protective shell after the IED that had taken his left hand and given him nightmares instead. 17 months of the world speaking around him, at him, through him, never to him. His voice came out like gravel rolling downhill, raw and broken and absolutely certain. Lioness. Jennifer stepped back. Blinked. What did you say? He said it again, louder now, his body rising slightly in the bed, the 4 lines pulling taut. Lioness. Her call sign. Helmand Province. Operation Graveyard. She pulled me out of the rubble when I was 6 years old. She was my mother for 1 day. 1 day and then she was gone. Jennifer's hands began to tremble. The veteran's eyes opened at 03 for 7 hours. Not gradually. All at once. Like a switch flipped inside the darkness where he'd been sleeping for 72 hours, and suddenly the fluorescent ceiling tiles came into focus above him, and the ventilator's wheeze became sound instead of sensation. His hand moved first, searching, reaching, and caught the sleeve of the young nurse checking his vitals. Her name was Emma, fresh out of orientation, still writing everything down in her little notebook. She nearly dropped the blood pressure cuff. Hey, it's okay, she whispered, stepping closer. You're safe. You're at Sacred Heart. You. His fingers clamped harder on her wrist. His mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. Just the shape of a word his throat hadn't made in 4 months. The silence stretched like a held breath. And then, so quiet she almost missed it, a single word scraped across his vocal cords like gravel under a boot, lioness. Emma's hands began to shake. Not from fear. From recognition. She'd heard the stories in the break room. The whispered conversations that stopped when administration walked past. The nurse everyone called invisible. The one who'd been escorted out with a cardboard box 3 hours ago. The veteran's eyes held hers with the intensity of someone who'd been voiceless and was finally being heard. She moved without thinking, pulling up his classified file on the tablet, a file that should have been flagged but wasn't, because who reads veteran histories carefully anymore? The words came through as she scrolled, classified Operation Graveyard, Helmand Province. Rescued from rubble collapse, age 7, by Major Sarah Chen, Special Forces. Subject subsequently joined Army Rangers at age 18. Current designation, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon Leader. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. You were the child. The veteran nodded once. His hand released her wrist and dropped back to the mattress, and when he closed his eyes, tears slid down the sides of his face without a sound. She'd saved his life twice. Once in the rubble 20 years ago when he was too young to remember anything but her voice telling him to breathe. And now again, in a hospital room, when she'd used hands that knew how to stop bleeding the way most people know how to tie their shoes. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Ashford. Not yet. The boots arrived at 1,642 hours. Combat boots on Sacred Heart tile. Not a run, not a shuffle, a measured cadence that made the entire 3rd floor go quiet. 32 people in the main corridor witnessed it. A SEAL team leader in dress whites, chest full of ribbons, gold trident gleaming under the lights. Behind him, 2 more operators in full dress uniform, and behind them, the kind of silence that only comes when people recognize the weight of what they're seeing. The uniformed officer walked directly to Dr. Ashford's administrative office, found him absent, and proceeded to the hospital board conference room instead, his presence filling the hallway like pressure before a storm. I'm looking for information on one of your physicians, the SEAL said to the administration clerk, his voice measured and precise. Dr. Ashford. Chief of Surgery. I need to know his current location. The clerk's fingers trembled on her keyboard. Everyone who worked at Sacred Heart knew the story by then. The night shift nurse. The suspension. The cardboard box. The rumor mill had been working overtime since 0600 hours. He's not here right now, the clerk managed. When will he be in? He has a television interview at 5 o'clock. Channel 7. She stopped, understanding dawning on her face. He's going to talk about Sarah. The SEAL's jaw tightened. His hand clenched once, then released. "Where is Major Chen?" The clerk gave him an address 3 blocks away. A bus stop. A bench. Rain. Dr. Ashford sat in the green room at Channel 7 News at 1700 hours, his suit perfectly pressed, his hair perfectly trimmed, his carefully prepared statement folded on the table in front of him. He'd been practicing the narrative for 6 hours. A delusional nurse. A dangerous breach of protocol. A patient she'd assaulted under the guise of medical care. He had documentation. He had witnesses willing to corroborate. He had the weight of his position, his credentials, his 23 years at Sacred Heart, and his connection to the hospital board's largest donor, his wife's father, who controlled 40% of the Port Authority contracts that funded Sacred Heart's renovation fund. He was untouchable. The anchor, a woman named Christine with the kind of smile that made politicians relax, gestured him toward the set. "Ready, Doctor?" He nodded. The lights came up. The camera found his face, and he began speaking about the dangers of untrained personnel performing medical interventions. About the importance of protocol. About his deep concern for patient safety. The words flowed like honey. Smooth. Practiced. Devastating. 30 seconds in, Christine touched her earpiece. Her smile faltered. Her eyes widened slightly, the micro-expression of a journalist who just received information that changed everything. She let him finish his sentence, then gently interrupted. "Dr. Ashford, I'm receiving an incoming call. I need to take this." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It carried the weight of something official. Something that couldn't be ignored. "This is Christine Brennan." "Who's calling?" The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for Dr. Ashford to understand that his narrative was about to unravel on live television in front of 340,000 viewers in the Norfolk region. The Secretary of Defense introduced himself. Not over the phone system. Direct line. Speakerphone. His voice filled the studio with the kind of authority that makes generals sit up straighter. "I'm calling about Operation Graveyard," the secretary began. "A classified mission conducted by Major Sarah Chen in Helmand Province in 2004. Major Chen served with the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company. She recovered a child from a structural collapse under enemy fire. That child is now a SEAL team leader currently recovering at Sacred Heart Hospital." Dr. Ashford's face had gone pale. He was looking at Christine like she might save him, but she was looking at the camera, and the camera was watching his collapse in real time. "Dr. Ashford," the secretary continued, his voice cutting through the studio like a blade, systematically prevented 7 different physicians from treating this decorated veteran. He threatened Major Chen's employment. He fabricated documentation claiming she assaulted the patient. And he's calling into your station today to further discredit a Silver Star recipient while obstructing care for a combat veteran. Ashford's voice cracked. "I was following protocol." "You were committing federal crimes," the secretary said quietly. That quietness was worse than yelling. Major Chen saved both of their lives. She performed emergency medical intervention that prevented exsanguination from a penetrating thoracic wound caused by shrapnel from a terrorist cell that was targeting American civilians. Your refusal to authorize proper treatment cost the government $240,000 in emergency intervention costs that could have been prevented with basic human compassion. Christine turned to Dr. Ashford. "Doctor, did you know your patient was a decorated Special Forces operator?" Ashford's hand moved toward his tie. The file wasn't clearly marked." "Did you threaten Major Chen's employment?" "That was a conversation between." "Did you call this interview to discredit a Silver Star recipient?" The silence was absolute. Ashford stood, his chair scraping backward with a sound like fingernails on glass, and he ripped off his microphone. The camera held steady as he walked off set, his footsteps echoing, his perfect composure crumbling with every step. The red light blinked off. The interview ended. But the footage didn't. By 1800 hours, the story was viral. By 2100 hours, the hospital board had launched an investigation. By 0200 hours the next morning, federal investigators arrived at Sacred Heart with subpoenas. They found everything. The altered shift schedules that Ashford had hidden behind administrative passwords. The phone log showing his calls to the licensing board, to the news station, to 5 separate colleagues, all with the same message: discredit the nurse. They found his emails. They found the fabricated incident report he'd written, his signature at the bottom, his handwriting comparing Sarah's emergency intervention to an assault. They found 6 other cases. 6 other veterans whose care Ashford had delayed or refused. A spine surgeon waiting 17 hours for a procedure. A burn victim sent to a competing hospital because Ashford claimed Sacred Heart was overbooked. The pattern was systematic. The pattern was deliberate. The pattern was criminal. The state medical board revoked his license in an emergency hearing. His assets were seized. His wife filed for divorce. His country club membership was terminated with a single phone call from the board chairman. His name appeared in newspapers from Norfolk to Washington with a single context: the surgeon who'd threatened a hero. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, and when they called her name, she walked forward in uniform for the first time in 20 years. The mute veteran, speaking now, his voice strong and steady, approached with the medal in his hands. He'd practiced this moment 1,000 times, this chance to give her what she'd earned 2 decades ago in a country that had tried to erase her. His hands were steady as he pinned the National Nightingale Award to her uniform, and when he met her eyes, he whispered so only she could hear, "Welcome home, Lioness." The cameras flashed. The room stood. The Secretary of Defense placed a hand on her shoulder and nodded, the kind of nod that meant everything official was finally true again. But that wasn't the last chapter. Ashford still existed somewhere in the world, and he had to exist somewhere specific. On a Tuesday in September, Sarah returned to Sacred Heart for a follow-up with her patient, and she took the loading dock entrance because that's where the quietest people worked. And there he was at 2300 hours, under the fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects, wearing a blue security guard uniform with a name tag that read A. Ashford. Night shift. Loading dock. Badge checking. Everyone who passed through that entrance saw him. The nurses who'd watched him humiliate Sarah. The doctors who'd felt his authority. The residents who'd learned medicine under his dismissive gaze. They all came through that door eventually. They all had to look at what he'd become. Invisible in the worst possible way, not erased, but reduced. Diminished. Present and powerless. Sarah approached the desk. Ashford didn't recognize her immediately, not until she was within 2 feet, and then his hands began to shake. The badge scanner went limp in his fingers. He'd rehearsed this moment too, but differently. In his rehearsal, he apologized. In his rehearsal, she forgave him. In reality, she simply stood there with the kind of composure that made powerful people feel small. One measured breath. Just like the parking lot, just like the moment before she'd pulled a child from rubble, just like every moment that mattered. Dr. Ashford. He didn't respond. Just kept staring at her uniform, at the medal, at the woman he'd tried to erase. True class is what you do when the lights go out. She walked past him into the hospital, her footsteps echoing down the corridor, and behind her, under the harsh fluorescent glow, Ashford stood alone with the next badge to check, the next visitor to verify, the endless night shift stretching ahead of him like a sentence. Outside, rain hammered the pavement like applause nobody would ever hear. Inside, the hospital continued its work, healing the broken, and in the loading dock, a man who'd once ruled everything checked badges and said nothing at all. If you've made it this far, you understand that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear scrubs. Sometimes they work night shift, invisible and unstoppable, waiting for the moment when someone needs saving. Sarah Chen was one of them. And somewhere in your community, there's another one. Maybe it's a nurse. Maybe it's a paramedic. Maybe it's someone you pass every day without knowing they've already saved a life today. If you know who that person is, tag them in the comments. Nominate them. Tell their story. The National Nightingale Award program exists to recognize the healthcare heroes we pass without seeing. Be the one who sees them. And if this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who works in healthcare. You have no idea what they've survived before they put on that uniform this morning.